Hello, I'm David Bro. Welcome to Realistic Creature Animation for VFX. In this class, we're going to focus on creating believable creature motion and performance. Along the way, we're going to use reference and talk a bit about using that reference to inform the movement of our creature. I'll also be covering techniques I use in production for blocking, moving into rough animation, and finaling of a shot. We're also going to cover some approaches to thinking about a shot, something that I kind of refer to as method animation. So let's go ahead and take a look what we've got here. First off, reference. We're going to be using reference of bats and tiger, since those animals share portions of anatomy that our creature has here. Realism is a style. We're going to be focusing on realistic motion and timing and sense of gravity, not really stylizing it or pushing it to, very snappy type motion. Then we're going to move into description about method animation. It's really just kind of the way I've broken it down for myself as I was learning. The analogy being thinking of your shot as a book and breaking it down into the different sub pieces of a book. Then we're going to talk about pose to pose, straight ahead, or hybrid animation styles. So which one of those is appropriate for what given challenge you have with a shot, whether it's an acting shot, action shot, or if there's some sort of controlling factors, time, frame count, whatever the case may be. Each of those will have an impact on which one you decide to go with. Okay, so here's taking a look at our character we're going to be using. Again, bat-like wings, very bat-like wings, very feline, cat-like body, nice long tail. The face, they're still developing the rig for this, so we're not going to be doing much on the face, but the overall body performance and mechanics and the realism and the way it moves is what we're going to concentrate on. Perhaps in the future, once they get this rig completely set up and ready, maybe we'll do another video covering some of the facial performance stuff. But there's quite a lot to cover in the body as well. So this is our creature we're going to be animating, and let's go ahead and move on to the next part. Video reference. We use video reference of real animals to reinforce our knowledge so that we're not just relying on what's in our head, but we can actually check against what the animals are really doing, how they move, the little nuances that they have. You really need good, accurate reference for that. You don't want to have a camera that's bobbling around and moving. So if possible, you want to take your own reference so that you can control that. If not, when you're searching out reference, you definitely want to find reference of, as a good still camera, a good front view or side view of your animal, something where you can really understand how they're moving. If possible, even if you're shooting your own reference, it's best to actually film that motion from both a front and a side view at the same time if possible, so that you have an accurate account of that reference from both angles. But if not possible, at least run through the action twice and record it from the front and the side, so you've got some idea. You can, break it down and approximate it. But you definitely, good reference is indispensable when it comes to doing realistic animals. Secondly, when you're trying to find that reference for your creature, what you're going to be looking for are animals that share some portion of the anatomy of your creature. Our creature in here is very similar to a lion or tiger, large cat. It's not necessarily a large cat, but it's very close in the way that its body is laid out and its limbs. We also have wings, so looking for something similar in that area, the pretty much go-to thing was bats. They have almost identical wings to this creature as well. So it's going to make very, very good reference. Another thing in your references, if you can find slow motion reference, which I have in here for the bats, and I'll show that later. That sort of reference is super, super useful to have, in that you can really see all the little tiny things that are happening, when the character's moving. So you're not missing anything in, motion blur or bad video or anything like that. It's kind of tough to find, but if you can find it, it's definitely useful. Again, covered the if you're filming your own reference, using multiple cameras if possible. Again, it's not always a possibility, so if not, use the same, use your single camera, but try to do the action as close as possible to the same way twice, and just film it from two different angles. It'll help you to see what's going on, because if it's not just important what happens from the side view in a walk, there's also a lot of important things that are happening that you can only see in the front view or in the rear view. In some cases, even the top view is informative. But it just helps you to understand the mechanics of the character and how everything is really moving, as far as a realistic being. Found footage, make sure you have the stable camera, and or side and or front view, if possible. Not always possible, but it's the ideal thing to have. Using realism as a style of animation. We're trying to replicate animals for a number of reasons. Probably the most upfront would be to keep from harming a real animal in filming. You'll see a lot of digital stunt doubles for animals or creatures. They use them for people as well. Sometimes there's just the need to do something that a stunt performer, whether it be animal or a human, just can't do without either hurting themselves or killing themselves. So that's usually why we get called in. And if you're doing that, you have to make sure that your animal is moving in the most realistic way, to not give a hint that it's a visual effect in these cases. These are the cases where we're trying to absolutely blend into the film and not have the audience say, oh, that's a CG such and such. So we're trying to avoid that. Need for fantasy creature to share screen with actors. Impossible creatures. Lots of movies these days have all sorts of monsters and creatures and characters that are whatever, half robot, half human. There's all sorts of need for these things that are impossible to appear plausible in a live action film. So that's another reason you would be using realism as a style of animation. The need for absolute physical believability. You want this thing to be 100% believable to the audience. That's the ideal thing. A lot of times people see things, they'll say, oh, that's not real, that's CG. When they start to get pulled out of something because of that, you don't want it to be because of the animation. It's, ideally they're not pulled out at all, but as an animator, we want to make sure that when this creature moves, that it's plausible enough that, it doesn't give itself away. If the model is good, the rendering is good, the lighting is good, all that stuff comes together to create, something very, very, very believable. Um, you can resort to motion capture on some things, but motion capture tends to have a kind of motion capture feel to it. There's all these nuances, but when you capture an actor or even an animal, in the few cases that they've done, really what motion capture is capturing is the movement of the skeletal system, the mechanical movement of the body. But what we see as an audience, as viewers, we actually see everything outside of the skeleton. We see the fat, the skin jiggling, the clothing, and all of those things give us a sense of weight, where motion capture, quite often people will say, well, it doesn't have much weight in it. And that's why, because we're viewing what's happening inside the body, not what we're actually seeing outside the body. So unless you take that motion capture and apply physics to the skin and, fat and clothing and hair and all that stuff, you're not going to approach what people think of as realistic motion, because we're not seeing that external reaction of all the things that we see day to day. And those are the things that give us clues about the weight of a character and the makeup of it. So those are definitely things that are needed. And I think a lot of people either misrepresent or misunderstand motion capture because of that, because all they're thinking about is the physical motion, not what we visually see. In this creature, we're going to have some challenging anatomy to deal with. We've got non-human legs, as you would in most creatures. It's a completely different sort of anatomy. You really need to educate yourself on how a creature, whatever the creature design is, how a creature like that would move. That's the advantage of using our reference to inform how we want our creature to move. The type of anatomy you have, some creature designers will, create these fantastical looking animals, but not always are they thinking about exactly how it's going to move or how it's going to behave. They're just trying to make something that looks cool. Some designers actually do take that into account, and some of the problems that you'll get with that is if you have characters with feet that are extremely large relative to their leg length, or their calf or the lower part of their leg, might be longer than possible. And I've had some cases with that with some little creatures that were kind of like raptors, where the lower part of the leg for the creature, which is actually kind of the foot on that type of leg, it was too long. And what you ended up with was a very kind of stilted kind of walk for the creature. You couldn't get a lot of flexibility in it because of the way it was designed. Tails. Lots of creatures have tails. There's all sorts of different tails. You can have long tails, you can have multiple tails, tails with multiple branches, which I've worked on projects where we had a creature with a prehensile tail that had multiple branches on the end, and each one of those could be controlled independently. But the important thing to think about with tails is, a tail isn't just a dead rope or something hanging behind a character. It's muscular controlled. It's used for many things. It's used for communication. It's used for, some animals use it as a rudder, some use it for balance. So, tails can come into many different facets of a character. And what you do with a tail, it's a very flowing kind of motion. So you have to make sure you have that. If you've got any kind of weird jitters and pops in it, in tails, they just show up really, really easily. Lastly, we have wings. Creatures, all sizes have wings. Depending on the size of your creature will depend on, how large the wings need to be, how those wings will act. So you want to be able to incorporate that idea into your creature. And there's different types of wings. Bird wings are a slightly different makeup than a bat wing. A bird wing is feathers. It has an aerodynamic shape that, as air moves over it, causes lift. Bat wings are a skin flap, and bats don't glide because they can't. Their wings don't provide lift just with forward movement. They have to actually beat their wings to flap, or beat their wings to fly. And then you've got insects, and insects also don't have aerodynamically shaped wings, similar to an airplane like a bird does. But the way an insect flaps its wings creates a low pressure area on top of the wing and a higher pressure area underneath it, effectively either thinking of the high pressure pushing the insect up into the air, or think of it as a low pressure area that's sucking the insect up into the air. And that's one of the things that makes insects, highly maneuverable. The way, they can shift their wings and literally have their wings pull them sideways if they have to mid-flight. So it makes them very, very maneuverable. But there's also a reason they're that small. If you put those type of wings on a large object, it's going to have a very, very hard time maintaining lift like that. A bird's wing is much more efficient doing that. And as you see in the animal kingdom, birds grow to a much larger size than either bats or insects. So, nature makes certain choices. So we're trying to incorporate that sort of believability into our creature. Next, we're going to have quadruped movement to deal with. Our creature, quadruped, 4 legs. There's definitely some differences there from human. Firstly, being that a quadruped generally pushes with its rear legs. Most creatures, humans and humans also, generate our power from the hips. You can think of the hips as almost the engine that runs the body. It runs the movement of the body. Everything kind of starts from the hips and moves out from there. So we've got quadrupeds. They're going to be pushing with their rear legs to propel themselves forward. They use their front legs to steer. They're not pulling themselves forward with their front legs. Now, that being said, the back legs and the front legs are working in conjunction for the character to walk or to move about. But I'll show you a little bit of reference of a large dog that's turning, and you'll notice that the rear legs stay pretty well set while the animal kind of turns themselves with the front legs until they get where they're kind of intending to go, and then they'll start pushing off with the rear legs again. So when you're dealing with a quadruped, sometimes it's actually desirable to have your root controller, rather than being in the middle of the character where a lot of people would put it. Sometimes it's actually to advantage to have that root controller over the hips in the back, because of the way the animal would turn or move from that point. It has a different pivot point, and the body acts differently. Instead of the head going one way and the butt going the other way, the head kind of pivots around the butt, or the whole body pivots around the butt. So it gives a bit more realistic sense of the way an animal like this would move. Tails, again, most used for balance or as rudders. You can also use them as a communication device. But they need to be incorporated into what the creature's doing. Tails can also be really, really helpful in creating your line of action through the body. You can use that as almost a pointer to help that flow through, from the head down the neck through the torso and out the tail. Can be very, very advantageous. Next, we're going to have some external forces on the body to consider. Gravity. We're doing a realistic creature. We have to obey the laws of gravity as we know it in a realistic world. We're dealing with a fantasy creature, and this creature can fly and it doesn't exist, but we want it to feel like it could exist in this world. So we don't want it to be overly light or overly heavy. It needs to feel like an animal that evolved here and can live in this world with us. And again, that's why we're reverting back to realistic reference to try to approximate what if an animal like this evolved, what would it move like? Wind, if you've got wind pushing on a character, whether it be a character that's flying, or if you've got a character that's out in an environment that's really windy, those things can affect how you walk, how a character flies. Wind can just affect a tail that's trailing behind the creature, or whether the wings kind of billow up as they catch wind. So there's a lot of things with the air around us that can actually affect how we move and interact with the environment. Also, environment concern is the ground or surface composition. If your creature's on rocks or grass or concrete or whatever the surface might be, if you're on rocks, maybe they're small rocks, little pebbles. Think about your creature when it takes a step. Its foot isn't just going to lock to the ground. It's going to kind of roll a little bit as those pebbles kind of push around. If you're on large rocks, you're definitely going to want a more sure-footedness before your character moves on. If you're in grass, all that grass is kind of folded over and built up underneath you. You're going to be able to take a step, but again, you're going to kind of slide a little bit in there. If it's wet grass, maybe more. If you're on concrete, usually a pretty solid thing to deal with. But then it becomes, does your creature have hoofs? Does your creature have, soft pads on the bottom of their feet that may actually give a little bit more cushion or kind of give, as your character's pushing their weight around, the foot might not slide, but may shift around on top of those pads a little bit. Whereas if your character has a hoof, either that hoof might slide on the concrete, or if it's sure, footed enough when it lands, it, may very well, stick pretty well, but you might even want to put a small slide in there. All depends on, the makeup of your creature and what they're doing. So definitely always think about the environment that your creature's in, as to what things are acting on the body from outside the creature. We've got forces from the outside the body. We also have forces inside the body to consider. We have muscular movement. That is a force. The muscles are making the body move in the way that the body's moving. There's a very different feel to something that's controlled internally than there is something externally. If you think about a person lifting their arm, to catch a baseball, as opposed to somebody grabbing somebody's hand and pulling it. The raising the arm, of course, to catch a baseball is an internal force. Somebody grabbing your hand and yanking your arm up is an external force. So you want to think about which one of those is acting on your character. So muscular movement is definitely an internal force. And I like to think of it as muscular movement has a proactive look to it. So it tends to kind of initiate itself and do something, where an external force has a reactive kind of appearance, where your character, is being hit or pulled in some way, and the body reacts to that pull rather than its own initiative. Any kind of supernatural powers or abilities, you could kind of consider internal forces. If your character has superpowers, they super breath, or any kind of thing like that, any kind of special abilities that would initiate from within the body and come out. Those are things that need to manifest themselves physically. You may have a visual effect to do, all the eye candy, but in your animation of your creature, when it performs whatever this ability is, you need to make it look like it's coming out of that creature or character, and that it is actually the body itself that's generating that. So you don't want your animation just to stand there completely still and have this effect happening. You want it to look like, your character, is inhaling a huge breath and then, blowing, this super breath or fire or whatever to connect with the effect.